Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first live event, A Cruel and Unusual Punishment, responding to the report, A Healthy Environment and a Healthy Economy. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. This is our first live stream on this platform, so if we run into any technical difficulties, please stand by. We'll try to do our best to not have that happen, and I especially want to thank my producer, Jay, who has helped me to learn this platform, and we'll move forward tonight. Behind Friends of Science, there's a small, very dedicated team of people who care very much about this issue. And our team of volunteers has worked really hard over the years to make sure that this kind of information can get to you. This is cost-benefit analysis. This is the type of stuff that our governments are not doing on the climate file. And this is very important information for all of you to learn about. And then you can make better arguments with your elected officials, with your friends, with your family. You can make better assessments of whether some of these, how shall we say, magical sounding solutions, whether or not they're possible, whether they're doable now, whether they're doable like a Net Zero2050, or whether they're doable at all. So I just want to say that our chat is open, but we do want you to be polite and civil. Please no personal attacks. And if you do start attacking people personally, whether there are others online or whether there are other scientists who we disagree with, we don't want that. We don't like being called names. We don't like you calling other people names. So we'll just block you. And that's not what we want to do. We want to encourage open, civil debate. So please keep that rule in mind. We're a volunteer nonprofit society. We operate on about $150,000 a year from our member subscribers. So if you can help out, if you can donate, if you can share our material, you know, there are many platforms that we're on: LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, our blog, and our website, of course. And we also have a plain language bilingual website called climatechange101.ca. So there's lots of ways for you to learn about our material, to share and participate. And we hope that you'll take some things away from tonight's talk that maybe you didn't know before. So I'm just going to get right into this now. And let's look at the overview of a cruel and unusual punishment. Now, the main presentation will address the lack of a cost-benefit analysis and technical challenges of the federal climate plan, which was called A Healthy Environment and a Healthy Economy. This was released about Christmas time in 2020, and in the interim, Bill C-12 has been introduced to try and legislate that the government must meet climate targets in 5-year GHG reduction cycles. And consequently, I want to provide you with the impacts of Bill C-12, and I'll first review the likely consequences to you should this bill be passed in the House of Commons. And in part two, I will deconstruct the federal plan by walking through with our rebuttal report, A Cruel and Unusual Punishment. So, but first, let's ask this question: do we only have 10 years left? Well, actually, the answer is no. And this is an Associated Press fact check. And they actually asked the co-chairman of the report and professor of sustainable energy at Imperial College London about the IPCC SR 1.5 report. This is the report that everyone says gives us only 12 or 10 years. And the co-chairman says the report did not say we have 12 years left. And they asked another scientist, Christy L. Ebby, and she also said, the report never said we only have 12 years left. And how about that 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius target? Is it scientifically accurate? No, it's arbitrary. This is from Ted Nordhaus, who talks about his uncle, the award-winning economist William Nordhaus. And he's widely credited being the first person to propose that a climate policy should strive with anthropogenic global warming to a 2 degree above Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. But he didn't arrive at that conclusion through elaborate climate modeling or cost-benefit analysis. He just came up with it sort of on the back of an envelope, and the standard, by his own admission, was arbitrary. So, just imagine the entire world is turning its life upside down over this arbitrary target. And is there a climate emergency? Well, as it turns out, no. So there's a group of more than 900 scientists and scholars called Clintel. They're out of Holland. And they say that there is no climate emergency and that natural forces are more influential on climate change than human forces like carbon dioxide. And then some people might say, well, if we do think there is a problem, what's wrong with pushing for rapid change? Well, Hans Rosling was an international public health expert and an MD. And here's what he had to say. He said that fear plus urgency leads to stupid, drastic decisions with unpredictable side effects. And we can certainly see that with, say, the COVID lockdown, where there are very tragic, unpredictable side effects happening all the time. So that's the kind of thing that we can expect if we plunge ourselves into some kind of a climate catastrophe urgent response as well. So in summary, we do have time. There is no 10-year deadline according to the co-chair of the IPCC SR 1.5 report. The 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius target was set arbitrarily some 40 years ago, before we knew much about climate change. So there's no climate emergency. More than 900 scientists and scholars of Clintel affirm that. And fear and urgency leads to stupid, drastic decisions with unpredictable side effects. So now we're going to go and have a look at the impacts on your life from Net Zero 2050 policies and Bill C-12. So much of this material is drawn from a report by Robert Lyman. He's one of our main contributors on policy issues. Robert Lyman was a federal public servant for 27 years. Before that, he was a diplomat for 10 years. He's contributed dozens of reports to us, and they're all firmly grounded in science and evidence, and his years in public policy in the federal service. So he brings very good insights, and much of the material on that I'll be presenting tonight is drawn from Robert Lyman's work, but certainly the work on net zero here is drawn from his work. So let's have a look. So Bill C-12, legislating the impossible dream. What does this mean for you? Well, it means shutting down most of Canada's oil and gas industry, which is one of our primary sources of income. Now, I'm going to post this PowerPoint on our blog so that you can read the detail after, but you can see here some of the key facts. Canada is the 4th largest producer and 3rd largest exporter of oil in the world, and none of our competitors are shutting down their economy for any climate deal. Shutting down most of the emissions-intensive industrial plants in the mining, petrochemical, metal fabrication, steel, cement, and pulp and paper industries. So this is going to hit every major industry in Canada, not just oil and gas. I know a lot of people go, oh, you people in Alberta, you're always crying about oil and gas. Well, it's coming to your backyard. It will double or triple the cost of products like gasoline, diesel fuel, natural gas, and propane. Double or triple those costs. And it will also, Bill C-12 will also incur the banning of the use of natural gas for heating. And that means converting residential and commercial heating systems to electricity. And if you remember what happened in Texas a few weeks ago in that cold snap, that's not a very good thing. Bill C-12 will also force the use of electric cars and trucks, whether that's feasible or competitive or not. It will double or triple the cost of electricity. while sharply increasing the number of brownouts and blackouts, and I'll explain a bit more about that later. It would mean replacing the electrical distribution systems in every community and house in Canada at the cost of hundreds of billions of dollars, and it would double or triple the cost of airfares and air freight. It would add $100,000 to the cost of a new house based on the changed building codes. And there'd be more losses and implications. We would lose investment and jobs in many industries to countries like Mexico and China that do not impose similar policies and taxes. And it would mean unprecedented government regulatory control over all aspects of the economy and COVID-like restrictions for the indefinite future. It would mean losing hundreds of billions of dollars due to the premature retirement of major energy producing and using infrastructure. You know, because most of the, say, the fossil fuel infrastructure was built for 40, 50, 100 years. So, you know, would we just abandon that and abandon all that value? There would also be some secondary impacts. There would be a significant reduction in Alberta's population. There would be similar depopulation of the resource industry dependent northern communities across Canada. There would be a large deterioration in Canada's trade balance. There would be the devaluation of Canadian currency with a 60-cent dollar possible, and a consequent large increase in inflation. There would also be a reduction in Canadian incomes and standards of living. So who is behind this Bill C-12? Well, there's a group of environmentalists, or environmental charities, if you like. I'm not sure that is charitable what they're doing to us, but they call themselves charities. And they issued this policy brief, a new Canadian Climate Accountability Act. So you find Eco-Justice, CanRAC, which is actually a group of over 100 ENGOs and some unions. There's West Coast Environmental Law, Equiterre, Environmental Defense, and Pembina Institute. Most of these are tax-subsidized charities, by the way. So you're subsidizing them to put you out of work and make your life into one of cruel and unusual punishment. There's another group called the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, and they are also very big on this. Now, we see that there are many conflicts of interest in these groups, and we've written this report called Dark Clouds of Conflict of Interest that outline our concerns in that regard. So we invite you to have a look at that. And you'll see that ENGOs like the David Suzuki Foundation are pushing hard for these goals before COP26 in November. And they want 3 key milestones. They want emission reduction target of at least 60% by 2030, below 2005 levels. So, you know, our emissions have been pretty much a flat line since 1990, and you'll see that later in the presentation. But to think that we could reduce that by 60% below 2005 levels is absurd. And it's sort of an off-the-cuff example I gave the other day is, like, imagine if you're used to having 3 meals a day, but now you can only have 1. So, you know, you have to look at everything in your life as being reduced by that much. They also claim that they're going to build a climate plan that's based on justice for workers. Well, I don't know what's the justice if you're putting people out of work. Indigenous people, what's the justice in putting up wind farms on Indigenous people's property and using tax subsidies to make green crony capitalists rich rather than providing them with fresh drinking water and proper housing? You know, this is where we should be spending our money for Indigenous people. And so they try to make this look like a climate justice issue, but it's unjust to put the rest of the country into this cruel and unusual punishment. And of course, here is the kicker: legal accountability, so current and future governments meet our targets. So they're trying to force current and future governments to meet targets that, honestly, look at this graph. Do you think this is a realistic goal? So you can see that since 1990, our emissions have pretty much been flatlined. You'll see later in this presentation that our population grew 37% in that time. So we actually did very well. our emissions did not grow that much. But now they're planning that we should drop down to this target of 512 megatons, and that's absurd. That's absurd to think that this could happen in that short space of time, unless there were some magical new technology. But magical new technologies that generate energy usually take 70 to 100 years to be implemented, not 10 or 20. That's crazy. So, I think we have to demand a reality check from all of these ENGOs and from perhaps the Charities Directorate. After all, the Charities Directorate demands that a federally registered charity must provide a net public benefit. And it doesn't sound like these are public benefits to me. And also, how will we reduce our emissions when the federal government wants to increase Canada's population to 100 million people by 2100? And here, Darshan did a quick math for me the other day when I posted this. And so he's saying that adding another 63 million people would increase our CO2 emissions by 1.5 billion tons yearly. So, every person needs a house, they need transportation, they need food. Obviously, these are not going to reduce emissions. And how can they ask us, the current residents of Canada who pay the taxes, to reduce our emissions when they're going to bring in so many more people? So in summary, Bill C-12 is an attempt to put into law the goals of greenhouse gas reduction targets. The impacts of Bill C-12 in a forced effort to reach Net Zero 2050 targets would destroy Canadian life as we know it today. Making laws to force reductions in GHGs when there's no suitable alternative energy technology that is market ready will lead to economic disaster. And Bill C-12 would offer an absolute field day for environmental lawyers who already want cities to sue big oil for climate change impacts, claiming big oil owes your community for climate costs. That's pretty brazen, I think. And again, this lawfare ultimately costs you and society, and similar lawsuits in the States have been tossed out, so it's like a wasted effort. And not to mention, it's a great way to drive off investors and jobs. So now we're going to get into a cruel and unusual punishment. We wrote this around Christmas time. The federal plan came out, I think, December 11th. And there was very little media coverage of it. And of course, everybody was going right into Christmas time, so it kind of got buried. And recently, it's cropped up again. So I'd like to just go through another overview of how this report will go. Now, there's a lot of material here. So, I hope that I'm not going too fast, and I hope that you will be able to review the PowerPoint subsequently and get more of the detail. I won't read every word on the page. I don't want to torture you any more than I have to. Okay, so let's have a look and see what cruel and unusual punishment is going to be about. Now, you notice that this image is rather medieval, and it looks like this woman is being taken off to be burnt at the stake as a witch. And I use that image because there's a lot of magical thinking going on, and it's a recurring phenomenon, actually, in history, that people have these apocalyptic times in society. But let's have a look and see what we have here. So a cruel and unusual punishment is Friends of Science Society's rebuttal to the federal report that I mentioned. We're just going to walk through the report as it responds to claims from the feds. And as I said, it might be a bit long. Feel free to put questions in the chat. We have a moderator there. We'll keep a record of those questions. We can write up a blog post after. And please, as I mentioned before, please be civil, no personal attacks. And again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And hopefully you'll share this information with your family and friends and your elected officials. Get people talking about it. We need open civil debate, and we need due diligence, and we need full cost benefit analysis of these policies and proposals. So here's what our report looks like, and here's where you can find it on our website. And here's Judith Curry. Dr. Judith Curry is talking about the toxic rhetoric of climate change in this quote. She's saying, based on our current assessment of the science, the climate threat is not an existential one, even in its most alarming hypothetical incarnations. So if you recall in the federal court recently, the Chief Justice agreed in his decision that it was an existential threat. But he wasn't actually talking about the decision of the court. He was talking about what's called obiter dicta, which is sort of the circumstantial material that's been submitted to the court. So the court never ruled on climate change. They only ruled on constitutionality. And here we have a climate scientist telling us that this is not an existential threat. The constitutional claim and some other court cases that are going before the courts are based on the Charter as well. If you look under the Charter of Rights, you'll find that there's a provision that everyone has the right not to be subjected to any cruel or unusual treatment or punishment. So, this seems to be a grossly disproportionate violation of our right to life, liberty, and security of person. Because certainly, as you'll see later on, many people would be forced into heat or eat poverty because of these regulations and policies and bills. And just as I was mentioning about the mystical element and magical thinking, this is Dr. Sally Bailey-Eunice. She was our first scientific advisor. She's a brilliant astrophysicist. But she talked about the Little Ice Age. And during the Little Ice Age, which was from about 1350 to 1850, temperatures dropped quite dramatically and the weather was extremely erratic. And she said that in that time, superstition and witchcraft bred a precautionary response, eradicate those responsible for the storm and this new period of storminess. Now, it was well known that people could cook weather with the help of Satan. So, thus did extreme conditions of the severest part of the Little Ice Age contribute to Europe's most horrific period of mass executions and witch trials. This was completely legal, and it was undertaken by highly educated upper social strata. And now there were skeptics who stood up, but they were often accused of sorcery to squash any debate. Does that sound familiar to you? It sounds very familiar to me. So let's have a real debate. Ironically, CBC, which is basically the government's state broadcasting arm, issued this report by Aaron Weary, who said Canada finally has a plan to meet its climate target. Maybe now there can be a real debate. Well, we'd love to see that. Anytime. Call us up. We'll get someone out there to debate. We would love to see full debate on this issue, anywhere, anytime, and full cost-benefit analysis. So I hope that this presentation will give you, the Canadian peasant population, which is on the verge of neo-feudalist society, some facts and tools so that you can engage in vigorous debate and prevent this cruel and unusual punishment of a carbon tax regime and the carbon serfdom that is being imposed upon us. Now, as I mentioned before, there was a Supreme Court ruling. They ruled that the carbon tax is constitutional. The ruling was based in part on the principle of maintaining peace, order, and good government and acting in the national interest. But the court did not rule on climate science, or it only ruled on the constitutionality. And it is interesting to note that Chief Justice Richard Wagner is also the acting Governor General. So something to think about. Anyway, how did we get here? Now, let me just come back to you for a moment. In 2017, I attended the Calgary Chamber of Commerce talk that Minister McKenna, at the time the Minister of Climate Change and Environment, she spoke to the Calgary Chamber. And I was astounded to hear that she went to the Paris Agreement, knew nothing on the climate file, and signed this deal, which basically sentences our country to total economic devastation. So I'm going to read you exactly what she said. She said, when I took this job, I immediately went to the climate negotiations. I actually didn't know about the climate file. I had to figure out what a COP was. What's a COP? What's this COP? Many people had been to more than one COP, 13, 14 COPs. I got there, I dug in, and we were able to get the very ambitious climate agreement, but then the rubber had to hit the road. Can you believe that? The rubber had to hit the road. Anyway, so the COP21 Paris Agreement, COP refers to Conference of the Parties, and that's referring to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was signed in or developed in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. So that's what a COP is. And so the neophyte Minister McKenna agrees to a 1.5 Celsius target, meaning much greater reductions are required of us. In fact, the Paris Agreement is actually a purely voluntary agreement. And it only requires reporting in 5-year intervals. So if you see what's going on here with Bill C-12, they're taking a purely voluntary international agreement and trying to impose it into law in Canada, perhaps to set an international precedent of some kind, but there's absolutely no reason to do this. So no due diligence was done to assess the likelihood of meeting these targets, and no cost-benefit analysis, and this is basically self-inflicted economic suicide. And here you can see it in a picture. So this is based on some work we did with Robert Lyman. This is in a couple of our reports with him. So what if we tried to meet Paris targets? You can see the emissions here in 2014, the commitment to reduce these emissions, and you can see that the government notionally committed to the 80% reduction in GHGs as well. That would be the net zero target, I assume. So, and what's the end result? Well, it would be like the Great Depression, like lots of unemployment. People would be freezing to death, heat or eat poverty. But you say, well, wait a minute, all these countries in the world signed on. Like, shouldn't we do our part? Well, why did they sign on? This is kind of the backstory that's never discussed in the media. The Paris Agreement is based on promises and bribes. So the Conference of the Party has been meeting for over 2 decades. They've promised to reduce emissions, but emissions have steadily gone up. The non-OECD developed nations were effectively bribed into this agreement with a promise of $100 billion a year in a green climate fund, which would be paid by you, by Western industrialized nations. Excuse me. So the green climate fund would be doled out to them without any accountability. And the idea, of course, would be to help developing nations meet adaptive challenges of climate change. But the anthropogenic global warming premise is theorized as being caused by the West's long-term use of fossil fuels and the emissions of the OECD countries. So, that's our reparations, if you like, to pay them this $100 billion. So I invite you to have a look at Robert Lyman's article, COP21, Just the Facts, and his report shown here. Who cuts, who pays? Show me the money. And Paris Agreement, 5 years later, where are we? So you'd think after all that fanfare and effort that emissions around the world would be going down, but what do we find? If we look only over here in the change percentage column, we find that China's emissions went up 28%. The US actually did decline 9%, mostly because they went to natural gas and shut down some old coal plants. But that was done without any heavy-handed legislation whatsoever. It was simply a good market choice. The European Union went down 16%, but you should realize that Andre Tajani, who was the former Minister of Industrialization for the EU, called it an industrial massacre there because the price of power was rising so fast that manufacturers are just moving offshore. So that's one way to reduce your emissions. Make sure that all of your manufacturing industries leave. And now the downside is you don't have any jobs, but hey, you cut your emissions. And we see that India's emissions went up 69%. Russia went down 0.2%. Japan 0.10 or minus 10%. South Korea up 25%. They have no fossil fuels, by the way. They have to import like 98% of their fossil fuels. Iran went up 30%. Saudi Arabia 35%. Canada, we went up 1%. Like, that's nothing. And in the world, on average, emissions rose 12%. So it looks like the more of these conference of the parties that they have, the more emissions we have. Because you can see on the right-hand side here that the atmospheric CO2 at Mauna Loa, which is where they measure the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, it's one of the world's most active volcanoes, by the way. You can see that through all of these different COPs, they all go by the name of the city that they've been held in: Rio, Berlin, Geneva, Kyoto, Buenos Aires, Bonn, Hague, Morocco, etc., etc., Paris, and lockdown. Even when we get to lockdown, no reduction in emissions, not in the concentration. There was about an 8% reduction in human emissions last year due to the lockdown. But overall, CO2 emissions did not drop. And if you look at the graph here on the left, you can see that world fossil fuel carbon dioxide emissions really spiked in China. They pretty much flatlined or declined in the United States and the EU. India is growing. Russia is pretty flat. Japan is pretty flat. So, you have to wonder why we have to bear this cruel and unusual punishment when it's China that's putting out all the emissions. And we'll have more on that later. So will the Paris Agreement accomplish the goal of reducing emissions? We're being lied to, because Bjorn Lomborg did the analysis of whether if all countries met their Paris targets, what would the outcome be? And he used the magic computer simulation that the IPCC favors. And he found that if we did nothing, you see the red line. If you do all the Paris promises by 2030, you can see that little green line. And if we do all the Paris promises every year from 2030 to 2100, well, it's like 17/100ths of a degree reduction in warming. And for this, we would be spending $1 to $2 trillion every year. So I invite you to read his book. It's very good. And it's actually a very apt description of the talk I'm giving right now. False alarm: how climate change panic costs us trillions, hurts the poor, and fails to fix the planet. Now, I showed you the graph of China's emissions and the rest of the world's emissions, and you can see here a map of the world. And if you look here, China emits in 1 month about what Canada emits in 1.5 years. So whatever emissions we reduce in Canada would be completely obliterated by the ongoing emissions in China. So it would make no difference to global climate change. And Robert Lyman wrote this report, Futile Folly. I invite you to read it. But he also wrote another report, because many people say, oh, well, it doesn't matter if our emissions wouldn't make a difference. We all have to do our fair share. Well, his report, The Tragic Delusion of Doing Our Fair Share, he shows that our good nature is just being taken advantage of by the climate movement. So, in short, no due diligence was done on the Paris Agreement. Ideology ruled over evidence. And, I guess that's basically what Friends of Science stands for, is we want evidence over ideology. So let's do some due diligence together. So here's the cover of the Healthy Environment and a Healthy Economy report that we critiqued in this report, A Cruel and Unusual Punishment. And the way that the report is framed, we simply go through and respond point by point to claims that are made by the federal government. So I'll try and not spend a lot of time on all the detail. You can read it later. So is net zero 2050 possible? No. You can see it right here in this graph. This graph ended in 2017, but it's really irrelevant because oil consumption continued to rise until this past year. So in the era of climate diplomacy, global fossil fuel consumption increased 57%. And there are roughly 12,000 days, this is from 2017, until 2050. And the world will use more than 11,000 million tons of oil equivalent energy in 2017. So thus to reduce global fossil fuel use by 90% by 2050 requires the reduction of 1 million tons of oil equivalent energy per day, every day, until 2050. Does that sound like that is possible to you? And here are the equivalents that would make up that kind of replacement. And that would be replacing an equivalent amount of fossil fuels every day. And over here you can see Václav Smil, who's an energy expert, author, and professor emeritus of the University of Manitoba. He's written about 40 books on energy, and he says that energy transitions take 70 to 100 years. Likewise, Robert Lyman wrote a very readable plain language report called Energy Policy Needs to Transition to Reality. So, we always hear climate activists saying, well, the world is moving off fossil fuels are dead, the transition is just around the corner. Look at this graph. You can see at the top there's a thin dark orange line. That's the energy that renewables provide to the world. That's it. And it's intermittent energy, it's unreliable energy, and you can see down the side here, the green part is oil, the red part is natural gas, and the gray part is coal. So this makes up the bulk of energy provided in the world today that's providing our energy. And you can see that this is just going up and expanding. And the lighter colored orange is nuclear energy. It's not expanding. And likewise hydro, it's not expanding. So it looks like oil, natural gas, and coal are going to be growing for the next foreseeable future. So, the IEA report assumes that Asian countries, and mainly China and India, will adhere to their commitments under the 2015 Paris Agreement, but they're failing to do so. They keep promising things, but just like the West also keeps promising them $100 billion, we haven't delivered on that money. So, can renewables replace conventional fuels? No. So, I invite you to watch this wonderful film that was made by Calgary filmmaker Matthew Embry called Global Warning. He sees it as a very human-centered film because he knows that people need energy to survive and thrive, for jobs, for industry, for food, agriculture. And as one of his interviewees, Dr. Fritz Fahrenhold, explained, you just can't rely on wind and solar to power society. It can be a complementary energy source, but they cannot replace conventional power. Now, Dr. Fahrenhold is an environmentalist. He's a former German Minister of Environment in 2 states. He's the author of books on environmental protection and climate change. He's written a book called The Neglected Son with Sebastian Lunning. He's a past IPCC expert commentator, and he's a professor of chemistry and former CEO of a renewable energy company. So he's really run the gamut of the whole climate and energy track. So you can take his word as evidence and truth. Anyway, it's a great film. We do get a little, you get a small commission for this film, but it's not very expensive to watch. I hope you watch it. Now, we're often told that, we want to be climate leaders and clean tech is a multi-trillion-dollar global opportunity for Canada, but it's not. And again, Robert Lyman wrote these 2 great reports, Empty Wallets and Empty Pockets. And he also did an analysis of the Natural Resources Canada Energy Factbook. And he shows that the Environmental and Clean Technology Products Account, which is usually referred to the government as the clean tech sector, had a total income in 2018 of 66.3 billion, but that's only 3% of Canada's GDP, and it's been about the same since 2007. So it's really not a growth industry, and we're really not climate leaders. It doesn't mean that it's not an important segment, but it's not a multi-trillion-dollar global opportunity for Canada. And this is very concerning. Are Canadians being asked to prop up a looming clean tech investment bubble? So this is from Rob West, who's a CFA, and he's quite concerned that there is a high risk of bubbles. An investment bubble is an economic cycle that's characterized by rapid escalation of market value, particularly in the price of the assets. And this fast inflation is followed by a quick decrease in value or contraction, sometimes referred to as a crash or a bubble burst. So you can see that green hydrogen, electric vehicles, biofuels and biomass, wind, solar, batteries, fuel cells are all deemed by him at risk of becoming a bubble. And in fact, in 2018, the CEO of the Spanish wind company Iberdrola warned that the prospect of a financial disaster for the global renewable energy sector was coming, and reminiscent of the collapse of Enron. For those of you who are not familiar, Enron was an energy company that was set up in the late 1990s. It grew very fast. They had some of the best people in the world. Really, they had excellent people working there, but unfortunately management had some very unusual accounting tricks, and that led to the total collapse of the company. And it bankrupted a lot of individuals. There are huge losses in markets. So that's what that fellow is warning about. That's a very serious consideration, I think. Now here's another element of the federal climate plan. They suggested that having a carbon tax, did a carbon tax reduce emissions in Sweden and Norway? So, it's not too hard to look this material up. And in fact, they claim that Sweden's carbon tax reduced emissions by 23% between 1990 and 2018. Like, that's a lot. That sounds fantastic. But in fact, it's far more likely that Sweden's nuclear power generation reduced emissions, not the carbon tax. So the World Nuclear Association says 6 nuclear reactors went into service in the 1970s and 6 in the 1980s. So they did have a reliable alternative energy source that allowed them to switch off a lot of fossil fuels. And in the early 1990s, Norway actually instituted a very stiff carbon tax, but it was found that the carbon tax contributed to only a 2% reduction in emissions. So you can see here on these maps, you can see how tiny these two countries are compared to Canada. So, there's really no comparison. And this is a constant thing that environmental groups and climate activists do. They say, oh, look at Norway, everybody rides a bike. Well, look at Denmark, everybody rides a bike. Well, Denmark, no place in Denmark is further than 58 kilometers from the sea, and it's pretty much flat. So, you probably don't want to have a lot of cars there, but that doesn't mean that it's the same place as Canada. Likewise, you can see here Sweden and Norway have no correlation to Canada in terms of distances that we have to travel, that we have to ship materials. Both of them are on the seacoast, so they have lots of sea freight access if we could only get a pipeline to the coast. And they also have moderate temperatures there compared to Canada because both of these countries are on the Gulf Stream. So their winters are nothing like ours. So what the carbon tax and rebate is really about. It's tax them and bribe them with their own money. We call it carbon kleptomania. So we've got a video here that you can see, and we've got a report. It's a bit dated, but the general principles are the same. Now, in the federal climate report, they claim that all economists agree that the carbon tax is the best means to reduce emissions. So, let's think about that for a minute. So what they're talking about is what's called a Pigovian tax. And that is like a sin tax. So the idea is that if you want to buy cigarettes and we put a tax on it, the more we tax your cigarettes, the fewer you'll smoke, because it will just not be worth it to you. But the problem is that with fuel, which would be one of the principal elements taxed, this is what's called inelastic. So right now, I'm not sure what the actual carbon tax equivalent is, but as of April the 20th, April the 1st, 2020, the carbon tax equivalent of the fuel taxes that you pay was $192 a ton. So, that's the fuel tax that you pay, and that combines municipal, federal, provincial, but that hasn't stopped you from driving. Most people still drive. So, this Pigovian tax idea on essential items makes no sense. It doesn't make you use less. And if it does, it probably makes you die. That's what's happening in the UK and Europe, where elderly people who can't afford to heat their homes anymore or can't afford to eat are dying either of malnutrition or sickness or cold. So, that's not the goal of peace, order, and good government, nor should it be, right? I mean, aren't they supposed to be, in return for our taxes, aren't they supposed to be caring for us, the citizens, making wise decisions under peace, order, and good government, not cruel and unusual punishment? So here we have the question, do economists agree that a carbon tax is the best means to reduce emissions? And the answer is no. And you can see a couple of economists here. On the left-hand side, we have zero carbon policy fooling 97% of the people. And this is Emil van Broekhoven out of Europe, who was a professor emeritus of the University of Antwerp. And we have this on our blog, so you can read the whole thing, but he explains that this is just a ridiculous notion. And on our right-hand side, we have Canadian professor of economics, Ross McKittrick, and he's pointing out that climate policies are based on faulty climate and economic models. So the climate models are running way too hot. They're much hotter than the observed temperatures, but the economic models are calibrated to them. So that means if the climate model is 3 times, 4 times, 6 times as high as observed temperatures, that means your carbon tax will also be equivalently higher. And even William Nordhaus, who's the Nobel Prize-winning economist who's often cited by climate activists and the government, even though he favors a carbon tax to slow climate change, Nordhaus's own model shows that the UN's target would make humanity poorer than doing nothing at all about climate change. So you got to wonder, how come we can read this material and the federal government cannot? So one of the magic bullet ideas that's being bandied about is hydrogen. So hydrogen, green hydrogen, would presumably be made from using renewables. So the idea is that when wind or solar are active and there's an excess, they would produce hydrogen in an electrolytic process, and that hydrogen would be stored for later use, so that it would act like a hydrogen battery, if you like. That's not actually a very good description, but it would have the same idea as having a mega battery, because you'd be using the wind and solar to create this hydrogen. But hydrogen is a very funny molecule, and blue hydrogen is produced through a chemical process with natural gas. So Samuel Fafari is a professor of chemistry and also a professor of energy geopolitics in Belgium. And he's written this book on hydrogen. He's been working on hydrogen for the past 30 years. And at first he too thought that it would be the magic bullet, but it's not. And he learned that himself through hard experience. And he's saying that burning hydrogen to generate energy when hydrogen has been produced by energy is like keeping oneself warm by burning Louis Vuitton handbags. Inevitably, any hydrogen produced will end up in chemistry and not in a motor vehicle. So here's another author from Europe explaining why hydrogen is not a magic solution for the EU Green Deal. And he says the explanation is quite simple. The conversion of electricity, green or not, into hydrogen implies a loss of about 30% of the energy content of the electricity. And whatever subsequent step taken in making the hydrogen into practical use will imply another 30% loss of the 70% energy remaining in the hydrogen, leaving us with perhaps half the energy in the original electricity being available for useful purposes. So normally when you try to get an energy source, you want it to be energy dense and give you more and more and more energy or product stream. And the opposite happens with hydrogen. So he says that this is not the solution for Europe, and he's pretty sure that it's lobbying by the European Hydrogen Alliance because there's going to be big money involved with the Green Recovery Fund, 1 trillion plus 7-year budget. Easy money, he calls it. So another aspect that's very concerning to us is that when we looked at the Canada's hydrogen strategy document, we did not find very accurate or descriptive detail about the risks of hydrogen in the hands of the public. And at the bottom here, there's a link to a plain language article that you can read. But here are some points. In industrial settings, like hydrogen is used, but it's used mostly in industrial settings, and there are very strict safety protocols and instrument monitoring. And that's really important because if you look at the item on the right-hand side, hydrogen is invisible, it has no scent, it's highly explosive, and it can generate static electricity when escaping from its containment because it's usually very highly pressurized. But that static electricity can cause it to explode. And why would it escape? Well, because of the nature of hydrogen being the smallest molecule, it can actually penetrate metal. And for some weird reason that I'm not sure people even know why, but it can embrittle metal. So what begins as a very safe, high pressurized container over time with high pressurized hydrogen in it, the metal becomes embrittled, then it can crack, the hydrogen can escape and explode. And the blast range is the size of a football field. And of course, it has to be stored under extremely high pressure. So these are the kinds of things that, you don't really want them in the hands of the public. But let's think about decarbonization, because, a lot of the emissions that people talk about are related to transportation. So people think, oh, well, if we just install EV chargers, have electric vehicle public transit or mass transit, then it will solve all of our problems, right? And it wouldn't be that expensive. So Robert Lyman did another report in which he ballparked the cost of electrification in Canada. And he says, using Tanton's figures, it would place the cost of electrification at somewhere between 2.7 trillion US, which is 3.6 trillion Canadian, or 4.35 trillion, which is 5.9 trillion Canadian. But this doesn't include the stranded asset costs. That means like abandoning, say, all the oil sands, all the coal, all the oil and gas. So it doesn't include the cost of just leaving that in the ground, or the dead weight costs, which based on the value of the proven reserves alone would appear to be about 9.4 trillion. So a cost of 3.6 trillion is equivalent to $95,000 for every person in Canada. And that means a foregone income of Canadian 9.4 trillion is equal to almost $250,000 per person, or $1 million for a family of 4. So how's your $600 carbon tax rebate going to stack up against that loss? Another thing that people never talk about, and it's not laid out well at all in the federal report, is that decarbonizing and adding EVs requires more power plants. So Canada would need to install about 10,000 megawatts of additional power generation for the present EV policy. That would mean we need to install about a dozen power plants like Site C Dam or Muskrat Falls. Now each of these projects is presently billions of dollars over budget and stalled. So just to start a new project, these types of plants need a horizon of 20 to 30 years just to build one of them. But we'd need to build about 12 of them. So there's not even one on the planning deck right now. And aside from that, you have to build billions in transmission lines and integration. So especially if you're adding renewables to the grid, renewables run on direct current power and the grid is alternating current. So you need some different kinds of interfaces and integration for that, which is quite expensive. And people never think when they're busy saving emissions in the future because we're going to EVs, they never think about the embedded emissions that would be required to build out all of these new power generation plants and all the transmission lines. And the other factor is that you need people to make investments in these kinds of things. We've seen in the news lately, that Canada is having trouble getting investors to invest in all the big projects. And recently the Canadian Infrastructure Bank invested in, I think it's an underground line for power, transmission line for power through Lake Erie to the US. So that sounds like such a great idea, except first of all, they have a number of nuclear plants going offline at the time that they'll be planning to export energy. So they'll actually need that energy in Ontario. Parker Gallant has a new blog post out about that. But secondly, if you can't get investors, or if you only get vulture investors, meaning people who look for these desperate opportunities where they come in and they demand untenable deals where we could be paying through the nose for decades just to satisfy the need for investment. We're not getting those investors in Canada anymore because partly because of Bill C-69, which is quite subjective. When that was introduced, PPHB bankers out of Houston issued a newsletter. They call it Musings. It's like a quarterly newsletter or something like that. Came out in April 2018, and they said that actually their view is that Canada has become hostile to investment because the government is picking and choosing the winners and losers. So, not very many investors want to go into that kind of subjective environment and risk their money at the whim of a minister who might, who knows, be replaced tomorrow with someone who has a different favored green crony. So these are very concerning problems because we might end up sitting cold and in the dark without enough power generation and not enough distribution, and unable to use our ICE cars anymore, our internal combustion engine cars, which most of which have 20, 30, 40 years on the road still. So it's a waste. This is the recycle, reuse community wanting to waste perfectly good cars and trucks, get them off the road when they've got decades of good life left in them. Okay, so let's go back to the presentation here. Now, just so you know, I'm not looking at the chat right now. I'm just concentrating on doing this presentation. So I'm not presently answering any of your questions. So I apologize, but I'm kind of a one-note samba. I can only do one thing at a time, and I'm doing that. And the other thing that I think people really need to think about in terms of decarbonizing and electrifying Canadian society is that in the event of a Carrington event or an EMP, a decarbonized electrified world would be fried. So the Carrington event was in the late 1800s. It was a huge solar flare that hit the Earth, and the force of it was so powerful in terms of, let's just call it static electricity, to be plain language. It was so powerful that telegraph lines lit on fire in various countries. It was visible to the naked eye. And these events have happened from time to time throughout history. If we had that kind of event, everything would be fried. There was an event in 1988 in Quebec. And one of these Carrington type events, a solar flare, hit that part of Canada. And because it's on the Canadian Shield, it has a very different kind of geological conduction, if you like. So it was a very powerful event, and there are pictures of the transformers, you know, those massive transformers that they use to manage the power between different regions of the country. It shows them just like fried, literally fried. Those things take months, if not years, to replace because they're not sitting around on a shelf somewhere. So this is a very, very serious risk to society, and we have to think about it. Now, the other risk is, of course, an EMP, and that's an electromagnetic pulse, which is a method of warfare, and it would have the same effect as a Carrington event. But again, it would completely disable Canadian society in a twinkling. And even if we had such an event and we still had fossil fuel cars and trucks and such like, there would still be problems because, you know, most of the pumping facilities run on electricity. But we would be in a much better position to recover quickly for the basic needs of society than we would in an electrified world of EVs. So sorry if I'm blabbing too much. Let me just have a drink of water. So are we saving the world from natural disasters like extreme weather with our climate plan? Will the Paris rulebook save us from extreme weather events and billions of dollars in insurance costs? No. Huh. Can you believe that? So this is a kind of cargo cult magical thinking that underlies many of these climate policies. And here's another quote from Judith Curry. And she's saying, thinking that catastrophes like major hurricane landfalls, massive forest fires will be cured by eliminating fossil fuel emissions is laughable. Well, it's not really funny. Thinking that eliminating fossil fuel emissions will solve the problem of extreme weather events is very sad. It's sort of on the level of doing rain dances. Everything that goes wrong, they blame on fossil fuel-driven climate change. Imagine how surprised they would be if we were ever successful in eliminating fossil fuels emissions, and then we still had bad weather. Isn't that something? You never hear that. You don't hear that from Scientific American, do you? But you should. So over on the right-hand side here, there's a very good book by Roger Pielke Jr., and he gives you the skinny on whether or not there's an increase in trends in insurance costs and catastrophic events. The answer to that is no. But of course, the federal government continues to say it shouldn't be free to pollute anymore. But in fact, Canadians have been paying for pollution for the past 50 years, about the time that these kids were born. So you can see the National Air Pollution Surveillance Program began back in the late 1960s. And then there was a Clean Air Act with the US. So emissions of pollution have been monitored. People have to pay when they supersede their compliance requirements. And I believe in Alberta, large emitters have to phone in their emissions every hour to Alberta Environment. I don't know if that's still the same, but they used to have that. So, the industry itself monitors emissions. The Alberta government monitors emissions. Most provincial governments have some kind of monitoring program. And we also have the GEMMAC satellites, which make 2 passes a day, and they also monitor emissions. And you can tell what emissions are happening based on the technology that they have on board. So, it's really embarrassing that these people think that we haven't been paying for pollution for the past 50 years, and they think that this is something new they came up with. I mean, you've been paying $192 a ton fuel tax for your car. That's a pollution tax, and you've been doing that for a long time. So that's $192 a ton carbon tax equivalent, shall we say. Now, of course, one of the big things touted in the federal report was planting trees. The Prime Minister met with Greta Thunberg and made this promise. And Minister O'Regan is very excited about it as well. In this tweet, he says, wow, look, 2 billion trees will capture up to 12 megatons of carbon by 2050. Wow, how about that? But if we put that in context, in 2019, Canada's carbon dioxide emissions were 556 megatons, which is equivalent to 1.6% of global emissions. China's, by contrast, were 9,826 megatons, and China emits in 1 month 809 megatons a month, or about what Canada emits in a year and a half. So if we look at the average growth in emissions in China over the past decade, it's 212 megatons a year. So this 2 billion trees capturing 12 megatons over 30 years is not very significant at all. It's it's 1/17, I think, of the monthly growth in emissions from China. And the other thing is that trees die or burn, and then they emit the same or more carbon dioxide than they sequestered. And that's why, in climate accounting terms, we Canadians cannot claim the boreal forest as a carbon sink. Furthermore, there's not enough room in Canada to plant these trees unless we completely wiped out the agricultural land. And you can see our little video on that. So what is the solution? Well, Canada and Alberta are in the oil Olympics. We're competing worldwide in the oil Olympics. This is our resilient recovery right here. You can see from this graph by Statista that we're in the top 10 oil-producing countries. And none of the other countries are self-imposing this climate economic suicide. The US has begun under the new Biden administration, but we'll see how far they get, because it's highly unlikely that they will want to become an impoverished state like the Canadian government is trying to do to Canada. So one thing that we should think about also is that Canada fared very well during the 2008 recession, and that was largely because the Alberta oil sands was churning through $30 billion in our economy and driving 500,000 jobs. So the tar sands campaign, which you probably have heard of, appears to be a green trade war against Canada and Alberta especially, enacted under the umbrella of climate change. So look at these countries again and tell me which one of these countries has a climate change policy like Canada. These are our competitor nations. They're making hay while we suffer from cruel and unusual punishment. But people will say, oh no, there's a consensus on climate science. But in fact, Roger Pielke Jr. and Justin Ritchie did a study, and they found, first of all, that there's an unstoppable momentum of outdated science, that much of climate research is focused on implausible scenarios of the future, but implementing a course correction will be quite difficult because it's pretty embedded. And in that same study, they say that it's even conceivable, if not likely, that in 2019 the world passed peak carbon dioxide emissions. So you see that on the top end of this graph, they're claiming, oh my God, this is where the climate catastrophe is. But the reality is down here at the bottom. And we're not being told any of that. But that's the evidence. So I think, you really need to challenge Bill C-12. You need to challenge the fundamental rationale for legislating emission reduction requirements. We already have laws, we measure and report, reduce and tax GHGs, so we don't need Bill C-12. So why are people pushing for it? Why are these environmental groups pushing for it? Well, what it means is that the proponents of such a law, they want to take the decisions on climate policy and measures out of the hands of the democratically elected governments and put them under the purview of the courts. They want to give the environmental lobby groups and their foreign funders an additional weapon to use against energy producers and users like you. You're using fossil fuels every day of your life in every way. They want the ability to challenge in court any new projects of any kind that increase emissions. And in other words, inspired by their ideological commitment to place emissions reduction above all other public policy objectives, they want a way to impose a legal stranglehold on the Canadian economy. So if you think it's bad now, let Bill C-12 go through, it'll be much, much worse. And interestingly enough, in 2017, Robert Lyman spoke at our event, Climate Dogma Exposed. And his question to the audience was, can Canada survive climate change policy? Today, I say that that's unlikely. At that time, he was optimistic. And he made this pointed comment that achieving the aspirational goal of an 80% reduction recommended by the IPCC would mean reducing emissions to 147 megatons CO2 equivalent. That would be comparable to reducing Canada's per capita emissions and our energy economy to the current levels of Bolivia, Sudan, or Iraq. So think about that. Think how impoverished those countries are. That's what would happen to Canada. That's what would happen to you. Now, here's a picture of Robert Lyman, and he points out that climate change policy is a threat to Canada. I invite you to have a look at these short videos if you don't want to watch the longer one that I just mentioned. In these videos, he shows you that people have been talking about cellulosic ethanol and wind and solar and geothermal and biofuels like for 40 years. But they're actually a very, very small part of the energy mix in the world, even though billions, hundreds of billions, perhaps trillions of dollars have been thrown at them. So, have a look at these, see what you think. And in summary, we do have time. There's no climate emergency. The Canadian Supreme Court only ruled on the constitutionality of the federal carbon tax. It did not rule on or review climate science evidence. Climate emergency claims stem from outdated science and misuse of the implausible high-end scenario RCP 8.5. Attaining net zero by 2050 will destroy Canada and impoverish the people, you. Implementing Bill C-12 will strangle the Canadian economy with lawfare, and the federal climate plan, a healthy economy and a healthy environment and a healthy economy, suffers from a lack of due diligence and cost-benefit analysis, much of which I've shown you today. So implementing the federal climate plan will submit Canadians to a cruel and unusual punishment in contravention of Section 12 of the Canadian Charter of Rights. So I hope you'll read our reports, and if you can, we'd love it if you could make a donation to us. There's a donate button also on our website, or you can go here. So we've got the cruel and unusual punishment. We've got penury or prosperity. This is a two-part report that responds to the 5 bold moves, which were part of the speech from the throne last fall. And this goes into more detail. This one, Part 1 assesses the geopolitics, these policies in context. So, for instance, one of the 5 bold moves, they're pushing for electric vehicles and saying, wow, look at France, they're all going EV. Well, France is already a nuclear energy superpower, so they have lots of extra power. That's not a big deal for them. It's the second most densely populated country in Europe, and they have a lot of infrastructure already wired. So for them to go all EV, it will be very costly, but it won't be that difficult. And of course, their temperatures are much more moderate than here. But for Canada to go all EV, the average population of Canada is 4 people per square kilometer. So, we're very sparsely populated. The distances are vast, the temperatures are cold, and we don't have EV manufacturers here. And even if we did, most EVs do not stand up well to the conditions here in Canada. Around town, perhaps, but most people who have to actually go to work don't work in close proximity to an EV charger. And as I mentioned before, even if you did, all of the power grid would have to be upgraded at a cost of billions of trillions of dollars. And in the second part, penury or prosperity, we walk through the 5 bold moves and critique things like the tree planting adventure. So here's a bit about us. We're an independent group of earth, atmospheric, and solar scientists, engineers, and citizens. This is now our 19th year of offering climate science insights. And it's our view that the sun and ocean cycles are the main drivers of climate change. So, of course, the sun also affects the ocean cycles as well. So have a look at our material. If you can, donate. If you'd like to become a member, you can do that too. Then you'll get our newsletters. So we have 2 letters that we send out bi-monthly. Our newsletters are CliSci, which is a roundup of recent climate academic papers and peer-reviewed papers, and Extracts, which is a roundup of policy information and tracks the IPCC adventures. And we also send out a newsletter 4 times a year. We have reports coming out all the time, press releases, and you can pick and choose. Some people prefer the policy side, some prefer the science side. So if you want to unsubscribe from one or the other, feel free. But you get, those are some of the benefits you get with membership. And, we'd like you to subscribe, if you would, to our YouTube channel, because we've got videos coming out all the time and reports coming out all the time. You can subscribe to our blog. So I thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's our first time doing this kind of event. I hope it worked out well for you. And I look forward to our next event. Hopefully I won't be so long-winded. But I had to add in that material about Bill C-12. Otherwise, I don't think that you would have a chance to talk with your elected officials about it, because it's going through the House right now. So the implications are dire for Canada. And you should know, actually, it's interesting that these tax-subsidized charities are pushing for this bill that will put you out of work and shut down industry. And likewise, tax-subsidized university professors in law, 28 of them, are also pushing for this. Now, recently there's been some outcry because there have been cuts to university funding in Canada. Well, if you drive off the major industry that is competing in the global oil Olympics, that is an industry that brings money to Canada for its product, what do you expect will happen? We need to have a thriving economy, and that's how you get a healthy environment, because then you have the money to take care of it. So I thank you again. Please look for this PowerPoint. We'll post it on the website, and hope to see you next time. Thanks to my team as well, who helped me do this, and have a good evening. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling. Good night.